it's always exciting for me to be able to introduce my good friend Hank Klibanoff. Hank called when he knew we were going. In fact, he was the one that called me and said, Peter Guralnick has this new biography on Sam Phillips. I bet he would come to Florence. And I said, oh. And so he put us in touch with each other. And then Hank called back and he said, now we just did a program at the Atlanta History Center and I interviewed Hank. And I'd be glad to come to Florence and do that. Well, any excuse that I can have to bring Hank to Florence, I love to do. So Hank, as you know, is a Coffee High School graduate. He's a journalist, award-winning journalist. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning author. He is now a professor at Emory and working on something called the Cold Case Project. So it is awfully, awfully wonderful to see him and his lovely wife here this evening. And with that, let me do a little bio on our guest, Peter Guralnick, tonight. Peter originally hails from Boston. And he and his wife, Alexandra, who is here also tonight, spend their time between Massachusetts and Nashville now. He's the author of several books on American roots music. His books include Feel Like Going Home, a profile of the blues greats Muddy Waters, Skip James, and Howlin' Wolf, and many of the great artists who got their start on Sun Label. He wrote Searching for Robert Johnson, who was one of our country's most influential blues guitarists and one of the most obscure because his life was cut short and there's just a lot of mystery about him. So he searched for Robert Johnson. Also, Sweet Soul Music, which tells the story of the songs that inspired a generation and I think maybe are part of the soundtrack of most of our lives. And also that includes a good bit about our Muscle Shoals music history. And then in 2005, he published a 2-volume biography of Elvis Presley, The Last Train to Memphis and Careless Love, which was praised by many, including Bob Dylan, who called it an unrivaled account of Elvis as he walks the path between heaven and nature in an America that was wide open when anything was possible. Not the whitewashed golden calf, but an incendiary, not a word I can do, musical firebrand loner who conquered the Western world. He steps from the pages, you can feel him breathe. This book cancels out all others. Pretty hefty praise from Mr. Dillon for Mr. Guralnick. And then he also just published in 2006 the book Dream Boogie, The Triumph of Sam Cooke, another one of those famous songwriters and musicians who plays in the soundtrack of most of our lives. He's written countless liner notes for albums and articles that have been published around the globe. He wrote and co-produced the A&E biography of Sam Phillips that was produced in the late 90s, I do believe, early 2000s. And when he was working on that with Sam, Sam brought him to Florence. So Peter had the opportunity to spend some time here in Florence, and he'll talk about, I'm sure, the time he spent with Sam here. And by the way, if you would like to hang around this evening following this program, Terry Pace and Anita will be showing that documentary in the conference room if you'd like to stay around. So let's see here. And then all of those, and then now we're to the biography, Sam Phillips, the man who invented rock and roll. Peter's been regarded as one of the nation's preeminent writers of 20th century American popular music. His books bring the life of people, the songs, and the performances that forever changed American music and really changed America itself. Ladies and gentlemen, Peter Guralnick with Hank Klibanoff.
Good evening. I'm Hank, and that's Peter. Okay. And I'm in awe. I met Peter by email, and it's a story that ties into Florence. I really wanted to do a favor for someone who, in Florence, who had done me a great favor. It's Will Trapp. Will here? There he is. And I thought, I want to do something nice. I really want to do something different, want to do something unique. What what's a gift? You know, I mean, how many six-packs can you give, or how many, just the latest novel or something? That didn't do it. He's got all the music he needs. And finally, I hit on an idea that I would go back and try to find the first edition of Sweet Soul Music that Peter wrote. And then I would try to track down Peter and send it to him and get him to sign it to Will, and then send it to Will, okay? And, I was a reporter for many years. I tracked down Peter in no time at all. You know how? PeterGuralnick.com. Okay? And sent him the book, and he was totally on board with this. I mean, and he turned it around quickly, and I was able to send it to Will, and it was, I don't know, it was probably one of the best gifts that I've ever been able to give, because I had Peter's signature on it and his cooperation. And that's how in awe I was of Peter, that I wanted to give his signature to Will. And since then, we've just had some email communication, and as Nancy said, we were able to do the event at the Margaret Mitchell House of the Atlanta History Center. I want to say, as we get started, what an honor it is to be back in Florence, and what a privilege, and I will, if I keep going on, I will get just completely blubbering emotional about it, but I love this community. And I'm so thankful for the Florence-Lauderdale County Public Library, because they just achieve so much, and probably with far less than they need to achieve, okay? And I see the staff and over again, and they're doing so much great work. And Nancy, you're such a fantastic leader. And I do hope that people will pull out their wallets and checkbooks and help this library, because they're doing outsized work here. The other... And I agree with Nancy that once you start thanking people, it gets hard, and once you start recognizing people, it gets hard. But there's another person who's had an enormous impact in this community who I want to cite, because he's just been a mainstay of coverage about arts and culture in this community, okay? And without the work that he did, many of us wouldn't know what we know now about the arts and culture and music in this community, and the world beyond wouldn't know. And I know he's a great favorite of Peter's, and what Peter says about him in this book is quite awesome and inspiring. But I just want to pay tribute to Terry Pace over here. So let's get started. I'm going to turn this back over to y'all in a little while to ask questions, because you will have some, and you will have questions that are far better than I, okay? But I do want to talk a little bit first about the book, and certainly Florence is just woven throughout this book. You see so many names of people you will know, okay? You'll see so many locations of places you recognize. And I don't, it was a thrill to read it, because I'm from Florence, and I knew what these locations were and who these people were, or knew of them. But I just want to open with the way Peter opens the book, and that is with the birth of Sam Phillips. And if you would, I just think it's such a great story. In anyone's life who begins the way Sam Phillips' life began is destined to make history, okay? And any book that opens with that moment itself is destined to make history. So would you tell us about that?
Well, I don't know if I can... Now, can you hear me? Am I doing this right? I don't know if I can do justice to it, but I mean, basically, to boil the story down, Sam always loved to tell the story about how he was delivered by a doctor who arrived drunk, and whom his mother had to put to bed, but whom his mother always recognized for the doctor's contributions, whatever they may have been. And I'm sure this is an upstanding member of the community, by giving Sam giving Sam the doctor's name as Sam's middle name. So that's why Sam is Samuel Cornelius Phillips, something that he was proud of, boasted of, gloried in. But I think he considered his birth something of a miracle.
Yeah. So we have Dr. Cornelius, passed out though he was, to thank, for this moment. So talk to us about Sam's early years, if you would. And I know he grew up on a farm at Bend of the River, and it just seems like such an ordinary beginning.
Well, you know, I've got to say that, and I've said this to many of you whom I've met before now, that Sam told me for years. He always said the real story is in Florence. And being the kind of person who, you know, I'm not a cynical or not even a skeptical person, but I'm going in my head, I'm going, yeah. We know the real story was in Memphis, but that's very nice of you to say that. When I came to Florence with Sam, and I've been coming here since 1980, Donnie Fritz drove me here from Nashville. He had to wait for John Denver, who was renting his house in Nashville. We waited for days, and finally we drove in this old Cadillac Donnie had. And Donnie introduced me to Jimmy Johnson, and Jimmy introduced me to Rick Hall, and I've been friends with everybody ever since. But coming here with Sam was just a revelation, because I had known Sam at that point I'd met him in '79, and this was 20 years later when we were making the documentary, which Terry was so helpful to us with, and Sam's nephew, Philip Darby, set up everything to do with that documentary, and we owe him an unending debt of gratitude. But Sam just came alive when he came into Florence. He became a different person. He was somebody, and I mean, you know, this sounds like, well, I don't know, this sounds like BS maybe, but I'm not exaggerating. It was like he was rejuvenated. He just loved this place so much. But I'll tell you about Bend of the River, which is something which I learned from Philip. Sam grew up on this 323-acre farm. He was born in Loveless Community. And I think the house burned down, didn't it, Philip? I think the house burned down that he was born in. And they moved out to this farm. Sam's father, Charlie, had a great love of the land, a great gift for cultivation, you know, something he retained all his life, something that Sam admired him so much for. Sam always spoke of his father as the quietest stick of dynamite you'll ever meet. And they moved out to this farm, this 323-acre farm, and this was Sam's Eden, and they lost, Sam's father was just renting the farm. They didn't have the money to own a farm, and Sam worked out in the fields along with black and white sharecroppers or tenant farmers, and this was one of the places he was first exposed to the music. But they lost the farm, or they lost the opportunity to continue, and they moved into town. When the Depression came along, they simply couldn't afford to live there. And in a way, the way Sam told the story, this was an Eden. This was his lost Eden, this farm. And he spoke of it. I mean, he would talk about plowing, walking behind a mule. He was saying, you know, you can't talk about anything real if you haven't walked behind a mule and smelled the smells and done the, you know. And he would talk there's a guy named Pete Daniel who was at the Smithsonian, a great historian, but primarily not primarily, but one of his things is agricultural history. And I was with him one time when he and Sam were talking about farming, and Sam knew more about more things than anyone I've ever met, but he knew probably as much about farming as anyone I've ever met. But he always described the farm as being at the bend of the river. And it wasn't until later when I looked into it that I realized the bend of the river was 20 miles away. And I mentioned this to Philip about the bend of the river, because Philip's family, I think, had lived on the same farm later. And Philip said, I don't know what he's talking about, this bend of the river. But this, in a way, it wasn't that there was any reason. This isn't like boasting about something. But it was a way in which things were of such importance to Sam, and he had such a sense of the mythic as well as the real. At least this is how I interpret it, that for the farm to be at the bend of the river was just perfect in terms of everything to do with it. But no, it was just, he loved it. It meant the world to him. We were down by the old bridge. He would point out where his father signaled on the old bridge after they had moved to town. And, just what a come down this was, and how his father never lost his love for the land. And that was really, he graded some of the, I can't remember what it is, maybe the amphitheater at UNA. And I mean, just all these different things his father did that connected him with the land. And the land, the people, everything about Florence. Sam said, I am a proud Florentine, and I always will be, and he always was.
That's great. He grew up in a household where two of the important figures in his life were his aunt, who was deaf and blind, or blind in one eye, and somewhat of an outcast, maybe. And then Uncle Silas, who was not his uncle, but was an African-American man living in the household. And so if you would talk about both of them and what that life was like in that household, and that sort of the influence that might have had on Sam, because Sam always wanted something, it seems like, that was a little different, and he grew up with the difference. He grew up with the other, as we say now.
Yeah, no, Sam believed in individualism, and he would say, in the extreme, you know. And that was what, I mean, and from the time he was a little kid, it's clear, and from talking to relatives, people from his generation, it's clear that this wasn't an identity that he assumed later on. This was the way he was from the time he was a little kid. And as he said to me a number of times, he said, you know, as a kid, I had no personality. He said, I had the personality of a green persimmon. It was his brother Judd. His brother Judd was the one, he says, now that's the one who really had the personality. There was nobody who didn't love Judd, but Sam wasn't interested in being loved. There was something else that was driving him. I won't try to define exactly what it was, but he was interested in expressing himself in his own unique and individual way. And the people he was drawn to were different in their ways, too. One of the things he loved to do, his first ambition was to be a criminal defense lawyer. And he always emphasized this was not a lawyer. He was a criminal defense lawyer like Clarence Darrow, righting the wrongs of society, getting at the root of the causes of crime, getting at the reason that people were discriminated against. I mean, it was like Black Lives Matter today. I mean, it was very much, and he would go down to the courthouse and listen to the cases. And I can't remember the names of the attorneys now. You probably know them, many of you know them, but he would describe their different approaches, their different methods, and describe with admiration how they addressed the cases. But in terms of his models, or his, the people who schooled him the most, his deaf-mute Aunt Emma and Silas Payne were the two that he would call attention to most, after his parents. I mean, and his family, he would speak of each of his family the same way that he spoke of each of his artists. Each had their own superlatives. Each was they were superlative in a different way. And it was a genuine admiration. I mean, Sam was a very positive person. But Aunt Emma was somebody who, Sam used to say that she was the smartest person in Lauderdale County. She would read the newspaper cover to cover every day. Sam learned to sign. If he didn't learn to sign before he learned to read, he learned to sign at the same time. And there were other people, I think his mother signed, and I'm sure there were others in the family, but not everybody signed. In fact, few did. And Sam just communicated with his aunt endlessly, intensely. He said there were other people in the family who found her annoying because she had such strong opinions about everything and she was so insistent on things. But this was one of the things that Sam valued, and he remained attached to her all her life. I mean, after he moved to Memphis, he remained the sole supporter, one of the only, he continued to support her, continued to be close to her. There are a couple of pictures in the book, I think, at least one picture of Sam with his Aunt Emma, and you can just see the bond of affection that joins them. But Silas Payne was a blind black sharecropper whom his family took in when another family who had been taking care of him just didn't have the money to do it. And as Sam said, our family would extend themselves for any human being. This wasn't a political commitment, it was a human commitment. And Silas Payne, Sam was a sickly child. I've never been able to figure out when he missed a year of school, but it's clear he missed a year of school because the difference between his 8th grade graduation or 6th grade graduation and his 12th grade graduation from Coffee, he missed a year in there. And he was very ill, and at one point he was, almost given up he wasn't expected to survive. But Silas Payne, he would sit with Silas Payne, and Silas Payne would tell him stories. I mean, this is one of the things. He would tell him stories about Africa and the batter cake trees and Molasses River. But Sam's point about Silas Payne, and they would sit and they would listen to the news, the gathering war news. I think it was WHO, maybe out of Iowa. I'm trying to remember, there was a famous broadcast. They had a big 50,000 watt signal, so you could hear that. And he and Silas Payne would sit there listening to the news and talk about it. But the thing that Sam emphasized the most about Silas Payne was that, sure, he could talk about Africa. He told Sam about Beale Street. But he could talk about Africa. And as Sam said, he had never been to Africa. He was never going to. go to Africa. He was speaking about a world that he hadn't seen, but he was speaking about the power of the imagination. He was saying that what we see around us is not the most important thing. All of us have what's right in front of us. But what's available to us is a world of the imagination. And this was basically what he learned from Silas Payne. And the other thing was just a sense, an approach to life was, Sam summed it up by saying, even if you're feeling bad, you're feeling good. And this was something that he attributed directly to Silas Payne. And it was just, again, it was an individual relationship, a personal relationship. I'm not saying other people didn't have that relationship, but for Sam, this was as close and as intimate a mentor, these two people, as he ever had. There were other people in Florence. It was amazing. As I continued to do the book, there were people that I learned about, a lot of doctors here that he was very close to and who helped him out a great deal. But every time he heard from anybody in Florence, he could be, this could be at the height of his success. If he got a letter from somebody in Florence, there was one doctor, and I'm not going to remember his name, I've got it in the book, who wrote to him to see if he would give an audition to the daughter of a friend of his. And the letter he wrote back to the doctor was just thanking him for everything and inviting him to Memphis and saying, "You'll always be my guest." And Sam didn't have a lot of people to his house, but if you were from Florence, you were always welcome.
Wow. And speaking of Silas Payne, you talked, when you were talking to Sam, he told you one day that Silas would say, "Samuel, you're going to grow up and be a great man someday." And he had no better booster than Silas Payne.
No, and the faith that Silas Payne showed in him. It sounds, you could turn this story into anything you wanted, and I suppose it would be possible in some ways to turn it into a negative, but it would be doing a real injustice, because for Sam's point of view, the way in which Silas Payne and his Aunt Emma dealt with adversity didn't just deal with it, Sam's belief was you work with the hand you're dealt. Whatever hand you're dealt, you make the best of. But these were the examples that he had in real life of people whose, the hand they were dealt was not an easy one. I forget whether his aunt whether it was scarlet fever that, that caused her deafness and her the blindness and
Rocky Mountain
spotted fever. Right. Sorry, but but the point was, it wasn't that they're. It wasn't that what they had to deal with was off to the side somewhere. It was the way in which they dealt with it, which provided a constant inspiration to Sam, I think, till the day he died. He modeled himself on the way that they dealt with the hand that they were dealt.
And there was no small amount of adversity. I think you say in 1941 alone, you have, of course, Pearl Harbor, the Phillips family church burned down. 3 weeks later, his father died just before Sam turned 19. And then his immediate older brother, J.W., got married, joins the Marines. Sam became the sole supporter in the family of his widowed mother, his deaf, mute aunt, and Silas Payne.
Right. No, and he... And Sam was somebody who, he described people. Sam described Charlie Rich. Charlie Rich was one of the artists that he worked with that he most admired. The person that he admired more than anyone, the one artist who embodied, I think, the ideal that he had of, above all else, of spontaneity, of individuality, of individualism in the extreme. The person that he considered the most profound artist that he ever worked with was Howlin' Wolf. Whom he first recorded in 1951, and who he said he would have recorded till the day he died. And but Charlie Rich was the one other person that he put on that plane. And one thing about Charlie Rich, who never really recorded, I think "Who Will the Next Fool Be" may have been the only song that he ever recorded for Sam that did justice to the breadth of his talents, as Sam would say that. But he would always say he didn't give him enough attention. But what drew him so much to Charlie Rich, and what drew him to go out and listen to Charlie Rich play in the clubs, which he did with very, very few of his artists, was he said that his nerve endings were on the outside. You couldn't meet anyone. Charlie used to say, Charlie was just one of the most amazing people I've ever met. And Charlie would always say, "I don't dig happy songs. They just don't do anything for me." But whatever pain he felt, whatever feelings he had, he was was very, unlike Sam, he was not at all a loquacious person. And not only was he not an outgoing person, this is Charlie Rich, he was virtually agoraphobic, which is really a burden to bear for a performer, an entertainer. But the thing was, what he put out in his music was a depth of feeling, like Howlin' Wolf. And he put it out without disguise, without any, any kind of screen. And this was really the kind of, this was what Sam felt so deeply, I think. One of the things that caused him so many problems. I mean, he and his wife, Becky, was from Sheffield. They got married in, I think, the end of 43, and went to Decatur. To the you remember the name of the radio station there? Anybody? The call? MSL, yeah, that's right. And so the two of them, it was a small station, they went there. And not long after they arrived there, probably 6 months later, in 44, Sam had what amounted to a complete nervous breakdown. And the doctors in Florence had pretty much given up hope. I mean, I've got correspondence in the books which is just astonishing what a difficult road Sam faced. At one point, he was in Florence, Becky was carrying on in Decatur. He couldn't bring himself to go, he couldn't get to go back to Decatur. He simply couldn't move. He was just stuck. And finally, he got his mother to go with him. But he decided that one thing, and he would tell you this. I mean, this is not revealing. I don't believe in these great revelations or these shocks or anything. But this was the kind of thing, if he were here and you asked him about Elvis, he might tell you about his electroshock treatment, because he believed there was nothing in life we should be ashamed of, that mental illness was no different from physical illness. He wouldn't be boasting about having overcome it. He would say, this was what I had to deal with, and this is how I dealt with it. And he decided that the only thing that he could, that would help him would be electroshock treatment. This is in 44, and this is not electroconvulsive treatment. This was in the early stages and very, very risky, and many people didn't survive electroshock. I mean, they were never the same afterwards. But that was what Sam had 8 electroshock treatments in Birmingham at a sanitarium there, and had that, and then again in 51. And again, this is an indication of how deeply Sam felt things, but in some ways, what the source of his inspiration and what he was looking for from the musicians who came into his studio, this kind of revelation of what's going on inside. Not pain necessarily, exuberance was what he was looking for more than anything, joyfulness. But at the same time, don't hide anything, just put it all out there.
He was an incredible developer of talent, identifier of talent, and a loser of talent. I mean, he got his pocket picked time and again, it feels like. And you're not being judgmental in that, you're just describing how it happens. What is it about that period of time when he gets to Memphis and he's developing talent that people are picking off as soon as he seems to discover them? Was he just naive or something else?
No, I think it was capitalism, and I think Sam would say Sam was a great believer in capitalism. It wasn't that he was against it, but the thing was that what he was encountering was the same thing that people encounter today with international conglomerates. Basically, he came to realize, or came to believe, there was no role for the independent operator in the record business, and he was proved right. I mean, he pretty much quit the business. He didn't quit it altogether, but he pretty much left an active role in it in 60 or 61 because he no longer saw any future for the independent record company, for the independent distributor. And by the end of the decade, there were almost none left. Now, I mean, the internet has changed that to some extent. Anybody can be an independent, but but who can make money out of it is another thing. And what happened in terms of the music that Sam developed, which could be called simply American vernacular music in a broad sense, was that it was something which was scorned and reviled, but more than that, it was completely ignored by the major companies when it first started. Somebody like Elvis Presley, or somebody like Howlin' Wolf or Ike Turner, I mean, they were not going to be embraced by a mainstream audience, and they were certainly not going to be embraced by a major record label like Columbia or RCA or Mercury later on. So basically, Sam and other independent operators had to feel to themselves, at the start of rock and roll. I mean, in the years leading up to it, Chess Records, Imperial Records, you know, all of the specialty records, Atlantic, all of them had the field to themselves. So you had people like Ray Charles, Fats Domino. Every one of them eventually went to a major label, because the major labels, when they realized what a big business rock and roll, or whatever you want to call it, was turning out to be, rhythm and blues, rock and roll, they jumped into it in a big way. And they offered money that an independent operator simply couldn't offer. So I think Sam formed a group called Armada in '59, I think. And they had their first convention in '60. I could be off by a year, but it's somewhere in something like that. And he formed it with a guy named Ewart Abner from VJ Records, with black and white executives. And he believed that this was the last hope for the independent record label. That forming this organization where instead of squabbling among themselves, the independent labels could come together, develop. There was a reason why the distributors were prohibited by some legal reason for being a part of Armada, but they were just as much a part of it as others. And in the first year, at the first convention, serious issues were discussed, serious ideas were put forward for how to deal with this, and the second convention, like so many conventions, turned into a convention. And Sam, at that point, that was really the end for Sam. Whether he would have stayed in it or not, I don't know. But what he did do was he went back to his first love of radio, and that eventually, in '72 or '73, brought him back here,
Right.
which was his first love even before radio.
Sure. It is interesting how many of his early, friendships and relationships were all around radio, and identifying that sound. What I want to talk about, if you don't mind a little bit, is his identification of imperfection and why imperfection was so important to him, why he sought out imperfect sound and made it the melody of the soundtrack of our life.
Well, Sam believed in the rough, the rude, the spontaneous. I mean, if any of you have read Gerard Manley Hopkins or a poem like Pied Beauty, that represents Sam's philosophy in a nutshell. And I wish I used to be able to quote Pied Beauty, but I can't. But basically, he believed that life in the raw was not only more interesting, it was more beautiful. It was more complex. It was what we should be seeking. I mean, I can remember being down by the river shooting for the documentary, and we're shooting this thing, and it's really by far the best footage we got, and we worked on this thing for 3 months before we put it together. But down there by the river, Philip was down there by the river, down by the bridge, and and Sam is talking, and he probably was talking about perfect imperfection. I mean, he could very well have been, but the thing is, he's talking, and all of a sudden these dump trucks go by in the background, and the cinematographer, whose name was Craig something, great guy, he stopped shooting. The director was Morgan Neville, who won a Grammy last year for 20 Feet from Stardom. And Sam says, "What the hell did you stop shooting for?" And, Craig says, "Well, the dump trucks." He says, "Those are the best damn dump trucks you're ever going to see in your life." He says, "You couldn't pay $2 million to get dump trucks like that. You couldn't, and I don't know, what is it, CGI? CGI. He says, you couldn't construct, I don't know if CGI existed then, but you couldn't construct a dump truck like that. To save your life." He says, "Well, that was real. That's what's happening out there." And he says, "I made a record once, which was by Jimmy DeBerry, actually. I mean, he didn't say that, but it was. But he says, I made a record once, and there's a telephone that goes off in the middle because Marion Keisker didn't, she wasn't able to answer. She wasn't there, and she didn't answer the telephone." He says, "You think I was going to hold back that record for a take that didn't have one, that telephone on it? That was the best sounding telephone I've ever heard." And you can hear it to this day. You can hear the telephone going off. But I mean, the point was, he was embracing what was going on. He would have Carl Perkins was the most eloquent in describing this. I mean, to me anyway. And he described how, he would be doing a session, and he said Sam would always get him out on a limb that he couldn't figure out how to get back from. I mean, and that was what, but But he said, you know, they would complete a take, and Sam would say, that's it. That's really it. And Carl would say, but Mr. Phillips, I made all these mistakes in it. And, you know, Sam would say, doesn't matter. You had the feel in that. And, you know, he says, nobody's going to hear the mistakes. They're going to get the feel. And sometimes Carl would get him to, you know, would persuade him to do another take, and they would do another take. And it would be free of the mistakes, but it would be free of the feel, too. And Sam would say, you see, I mean, that just doesn't have, he says, we're going for the feel. That's what people hear. And you know, Carl would always come back, but Mr. Phillips, you know, that was a mistake. And Sam would say, that's what we are here. That's what we are here at Sun. I'm sorry, that's what we are here at Sun. Just one big inspired mistake.
Which is also how we got the line in Blue Suede Shoes, right? Instead of, I think Carl Perkins wanted to say "Go man, go," right. And it came out "Go cat, go," and Sam Phillips was just elated that it came out that way.
Yeah, and Carl said he always called me Cat, you know. But I mean, they had a great. He and his cousin, his brother-in-law Jimmy Connolly was down there in Bessemer they had the Atomic Boogie Hour down there, who was a great, great influence on him. He met Jimmy at WLAY, and Jimmy was married to Becky's sister, Erin. And Jimmy was the person who got him into radio. But well, I forget actually where this was going. You asked me something. But,
go man, go cat, go.
Yeah, no, I mean, they would write to each other in this sort of hipster or hep language. He and Jimmy, or he would write to Jimmy. I didn't see Jimmy's letters, or he would write to Gene Nobles at LAC. And it's really funny because this was not exactly who Sam was. I mean, Sam was as Marion Keisker, his assistant, and somebody who was invaluable to him in building the studio. You know, she described him as elegant, as, you know, just the most beautiful young man. I mean, he was not, as he was in later years, an outspoken and loquacious person. He was very buttoned up in a certain sense. But you see these letters he wrote in 50 and 51, and just in this hepcat language. And it's really something else. And so he would call Carl Cat. But the other thing is, whenever he had a cut that he liked, a record that he liked, or, you know, they got the right take on it, he would say, man, that's a Rolling Stone. Now, this is going back to 52, 53, 54. So, I mean, and I'm sure it was from them. I can't think when. Well, it was Muddy Waters put his Rolling Stone out in 51 or 52. Yeah. So this is a long time before the English commanded that particular phrase.
Right,
but
right.
that was it. You can hear it once in a while. You hear him say, that's a Rolling Stone.
That's great. We're going to open this up for questions in a few minutes. I just want to tell you that this book is an amazing book. It's so rich and so encyclopedic, and it's masterful in its storytelling. I mean, anyone who writes at this length wants to tell enough compelling stories that you're just pulled through the book. And, you know, I think when we were in Atlanta, I said it reminded me, as I was reading it, of T. Harry Williams, you know, biography of Huey Long, that as you're reading, there's just so many stories that are so rich that you just have to put the book down. You know, I just can't, I'll never remember all these stories. Every page has a story, or two stories or three stories, so I would encourage you to do that. We're jumping around a little bit. I want to go to a story that you tell about a teacher, Mrs. Lanier, who,
Mary Alice Lanier.
Right, who's known here, perhaps by many people here. And I guess this is her letter to Sam at one point, and she's reminding him of a moment in class when she taught him, I think it was 8th grade. And she says, I taught you two subjects, English and what was then called social studies. In the latter class, we studied the preamble of the Constitution. Then later in the English class, we were studying the comparison of adjectives and adverbs. When speaking of the adjectives, I said that some adjectives could not be compared because of their meaning. And as an example, I used the word perfect, saying that if something were perfect, it could not be more perfect or most perfect. At this moment, she writes to Sam, your hand shot up and you said, but Mrs. Lanier, what about a more perfect union? She writes, I'm sure there must have been a great big pause, but how gratifying to know that you had listened and that you could think. The end of the story is that I think I must have said that I simply could not explain that. And at any rate, I went home to my family and we had a most interesting discussion at the dinner table. I called an outstanding lawyer in the town that night and asked him. I don't recall what he said, except that he rejoiced at me having such an alert student.
You know, I've got to tell you, the reason I have that letter, which she sent to Sam and which Sam spoke to me about and just expressed his shame at not having responded to it. This was probably 8 years after he said, I've lost that letter. I don't know where it is. And he said, this is the worst thing I've ever done in my life. He might not have said that in another time. He might have thought of something else. But the reason I have the letter is because her daughter, Mrs. Lanier's daughter, Andrea, wrote to me out of the blue maybe 7 or 8 years ago, 6 or 7 years ago, and sent me that letter, which her mother had a copy of, and also a reminiscence by her grandmother of Sam coming to see Mrs. Lanier. She had moved away by that point, right after he'd opened the studio in 50 or 51. And I mean, this is the way in which, to me, what's so thrilling about writing history, which isn't dependent on sort of the great man theory or just a single strand of history, is the way in which all these different things connect and in which so many people contribute to the story and so many people have their own perspectives and points of view. But I mean, and Andrea came out, I hadn't met her before we had a long correspondence, but she came out to see me when I did a thing in New York, and it was great to meet her, and she's a huge music fan, which I don't think her mother was. Her mother was just very proud of Sam.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's one of the magical points of the book, is that he just tells the stories and you are there to interpret them on your own and to come to see what a great man Sam Phillips was.